All right, committee, we'll call our meeting to order. And this is the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. And we are here in Fort Smith. In order to get things kicked off, maybe I'll ask us, everyone to rise, and I'll ask Danny McNeely to lead us in a prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everybody, for coming out to listen on the business at hand for what we are choosing to engage and listen and to make better rules and legislation and laws for the community that we serve. And thanks to the committee members for a safe travel from Yellowknife to here. Everybody got here. And we look forward to using our experience and clarification on the bills in front of us to serve our people in this community and in the rest of the trips that we're going to make. So assist the committee members to have wise choices and speak for clarity purposes to the public. Masi.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Committee, we have an agenda before us. Item 2 is review and adoption of the agenda. We have one item on the agenda this evening. And at this point, I'll ask if there's any declarations of conflicts of interest on the matters before us today. Seeing none. Item 4 is today's committee business, and we have a public hearing on Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, Bill 39, Environmental Rights Act, and Bill 44, the Forest Act. So I would like to welcome everyone to our meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. And at this point, I'm going to ask committee members to introduce themselves, and we'll start down at the my far right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Danny McNeely, the member of the Legislative Assembly for the Sawtoo riding and deputy chair for this committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin O'Reilly, MLA for Frame Lake and Yellowknife.
Good evening, Kieran Testart, member for Cam Lake, also from Yellowknife.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. RJ Simpson, MLA for Hay River North.
Thank you. My name's Corey Vanthine. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Salt River First Nation. I also want to take this time to also introduce some of the staff that we have with us today. We have from our committee clerk, Mr. Michael Ball, from our research division, Mr. Stephen Dunbar, and with our public affairs and communications, Jean Uris, that is also with us today. So I'd like to start with some opening comments. Today, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is holding a public hearing on Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, Bill 39, Environmental Rights Act, and Bill 44, the Forest Act. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is a committee of regular members of the Legislative Assembly. The bills we are reviewing today were introduced by the government. They were given first and second reading in the Legislative Assembly and then referred to the Standing Committee for review. The Standing Committee is holding public hearings on these bills in the communities of Fort Smith, Katlodichi First Nation, Hay River, Fort Providence, Betchico, Inuvik, and Norman Wells before holding the final meeting in Yellowknife. And then we will report back to the Legislative Assembly on the proposed legislation during the upcoming August sitting of the Legislative Assembly. It is our responsibility as a standing committee to consult with residents of the Northwest Territories on what they would like or don't like about these bills. We would like to hear your views and comments, which will be used by the committee to identify any changes we would like to see made to the draft legislation, and which we will then report back to our colleagues in the Assembly. I wish to briefly describe the intent of these bills. Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, proposes to establish new legislation that will allow GNWT to create permanent protected areas in the NWT where there are important plants, animals, land, cultural, or historical sites. It also allows for co-management of a protected area within an Indigenous government, with an Indigenous government or organization. This bill says what is allowed to happen in protected areas and what is not allowed. Mining exploration, oil and gas development, and exploration and energy development are prohibited. Small-scale renewable energy projects may be developed within a protected area or by an adjacent community. Roads or power lines may be permitted with consultation of the Protected Areas Management Board. Bill 39, Environmental Rights Act, proposes to change the existing legislation by protecting people's rights to a healthy environment, help ensure the GNWT always considers how the environment could be affected and investigate when a person reports to the minister that someone has harmed or could harm the environment, gives residents of the NWT tools to help the GNWT protect the environment. The GNWT must write a report every 4 years on the state of the NWT's environment, which will be reviewed by the Legislative Assembly and allow time for public comment. Bill 44, Forest Act, proposes to establish new legislation that will provide tools for managing forest and the use of forest in the NWT to keep them healthy, provide tools to prevent and respond to wildfires, create forest harvesting agreements, permits, and licenses, allows the GNWT to create rules around harvesting timber, and creates rules on burning outside communities, allows the GNWT to create rules for harvesting of other forest resources, such as berries, mushrooms, and other plants, respond to insects, invasive plants, and forest diseases. There are copies of the bills and plain language materials on the side table. Please help yourself. If you'd like to share your views with us today, please let the clerk know. They'll be sure to get you on the list. We'll also accept written submissions by postal mail or email until May 3rd, 2019 at 5 p.m. One final piece of housekeeping. Please remember that all submissions will be part of official committee records and may be reflected in our final report. Any submissions made during this meeting may also be televised or broadcast via social media. So thank you everyone for your patience in allowing this introduction. With members' agreement, we can now open the floor to comments from the public. Do members agree? Thank you. So we will start by opening the floor to anyone who wishes to make comments, and we'll start with Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act. So are there any members of the public that would like to speak on Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act? Going twice. If there's any members of the public that wishes to speak on Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, Mr. Testart.
Thank you. I just noticed that we have a former member of Parliament, Mr. Bevington, in the audience, and one of the issues with this bill that I see is that some of the changes that can be made to protected areas after they've been brought into effect is by regulation, essentially through order in council, rather than a formal legislative process, unlike the protected areas, the federal protected areas legislation, which has separate bills brought forward to designate a protected area, and any changes to those areas need the consent of the House of Commons. I'm wondering if you're able to share any experience you have with that system. I think it might be better to ensure proper public oversight. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I think that having the legislature have some say if there's a boundary change, especially given the significance of a protected area that's supposed to last in perpetuity, when the way the bill's currently worded, it can be a near unilateral decision of the government of the day and of impacted Indigenous nations, but it doesn't have the same public scrutiny that the federal model has. So I'm wondering if you have any perspective you'd like to share with that, and no pressure if you don't.
Well, it brings up one question. What was the co-drafting process between the First Nations the government of Northwest Territories on this bill, because of course that's something that is extremely significant and may lead to either a bill that's happily accepted or one that doesn't have the same kind of approval, because of course the process here of protected areas is one that over the course of governments can change, individuals can change, and the directions can change. Communities may have, and First Nations may have expected that these relationships of the land are permanent, and for that not to be the case obviously requires some due diligence between the government and the First Nations and the Inuvialuit and the Métis. So there's groups that are of significance and that have standing on these issues that must be part of those decisions. And I think when I think of land and devolution, I think of Chapter 6 in the devolution process and what we've done with it so far. In other words, the relationship between government of Northwest Territories and the Indigenous groups, and how that is going to play out and how that would affect this type of legislation I think is really important, because of course I don't think we've come to a final delineation of Chapter 6 of the devolution agreement, and it is in the hands of, to a great degree, of the people of the North to deal with. So I would say that that this particular point that you brought up is a very good point. It needs further delineation, because I don't think we completely understand the nature of the relationship that will exist in the future. That's under Chapter 6. We haven't gone through a constitutional process. We don't know how powers are going to be completely handled in the future. So I think there needs to be some room within any of this legislation to deal with the changes that may take place about the relationships between Indigenous governments and public government in the Northwest Territories. So so I think that's where the rubber hits the road here. And so I'd encourage you to look very hard at that issue and to understand how that's going to play out in the future, because we're not in a state of agreement yet on the final nature of the Northwest Territories.
All right. Thank you very much. Did you have follow-up comments, Mr. Testart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bevington. No, I don't. I think that's a very salient point. And I'll make a comment, but I think the what the future of the Northwest Territories looks like is an ongoing conversation we need to have. And devolution, I think, is a renewal of that process, but we still have a far way to go. And these bills represent the long-awaited realization of Chapter 6 in some form, and now we need to see how far we take it, and what really our role as a standing committee is another crucial question. As you said, the co-drafting process is really crucial to the look and shape of these bills and how they'll impact future constitutional relationships, and our ability as a standing committee to assess those bills, to change those bills that might deviate from what was intended in the co-drafting. That's even a question of is this the model we're or how this model is going to work for the future of our territory in this new deal. So those are very live issues, and I thank you for your thoughtful commentary on them. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, for the record, I would be remiss. I want to take this opportunity to recognize that we do have a former Member of Parliament for the Northwest Territories, Mr. Dennis Bevington, here this evening, and also our colleague, MLA from Thabacha, Minister of Lands, Minister of Justice, also Minister of Public Engagement and Transparency, Mr. Lou Siebert, here with us tonight. So thank you both for coming and attending. And so if there are no further comments with regard to Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, going once, going twice. If we have no further comments on Bill 38, we will open the floor to anyone wishing to make comments on Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act. Do we have any member of the public that would like to provide comment this evening on Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act? I ask that a microphone please be given to Mr. Bevington.
I have concerns with the act in how it will enable monitoring. I think that one of the key issues that we will face as people up here is air quality. It's, you'd think, well, we live in this vast territory where air quality is determined by dilution, but really more and more we see that air quality is determined by what happens in your home, on the streets in your community. And I think anyone that has spent a winter or two in Yellowknife when there's an inversion knows very well what the conditions of air quality are at those times. And the same applies in smaller communities where we still run diesel gen sets in the middle of communities with very little. I think I can remember only one air monitoring exercise done in Wati on the air quality of the emissions from diesel gen sets, and that was done on a fine summer day when the wind was blowing, and the monitoring equipment was set not downwind but to the side. And I just say that air quality and the right to breathe clean air and the right to know what you're breathing, I think is a fundamental human right that we can make the case for in the Northwest Territories. We have clean air. We're not industrially polluted in most of our places, but our communities and our homes are problem areas. And I would like to think that if we're setting up an environmental Bill of Rights, that within that there's a very clear understanding of what the issues of the environment are. I know I spoke to an environmental audit that was being conducted here last week or week before, and they were asking for comments, and it became clear to me that the audit wasn't really looking at the human condition. It was putting more effort into other conditions, which were very important, but the human condition is one that we all have a priority with. And I think that within this Environmental Bill of Rights, I think it should be clearly, and I don't know if it is because I haven't read the legislation, whether it's clearly defined what it is that we are going to ensure that the people of the Northwest Territories first have a clear understanding of what the conditions are, and a clear understanding that there is a process to mitigate those conditions. We use diesel quite a bit in our communities, and it's a proven carcinogen. It's been listed in the U.S. I mean, so where does it come in where we actually take the standards that are available to us and apply them to our own communities? And that's something that I think it's not just simply applying or coming up with a reading and reporting. It's actually how do we mitigate what is going on, and I think that's something that I would like to see in the legislation, and perhaps the committee members would comment on how they see this legislation working in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Bevington. I really appreciate you sharing your concerns. Is there any committee member that would care to share some additional comment with regard to that? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the interesting observations from Mr. Bevington, and there's a good preamble in the Environmental Rights Act, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. It does set out the right to a healthy environment, but a healthy environment is not defined in the Act, and the right to a healthy environment is only the rights as defined in the legislation itself, and they pertain to the ability to request an investigation of a matter. There's some whistleblower protection. There's state of the environment reporting. There is also the ability or a right to a standing before a court in pursuing environmental rights or environmental justice in one way or another. But the rights as defined in the legislation itself. It's not a right to a healthy environment per se. It's the rights that are established in the bill itself. So it's not really constitutional. There's no constitutional right to a healthy environment established under this legislation. But if you have any other ideas or suggestions beyond what I've spoken about and how to improve that or make it enforceable in one way or another, I would certainly be interested in hearing more about that. But thanks for your input. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we'll have the mic return to Mr. Bevington. He has additional comment.
Well, I think the legislation needs to identify first what clearly the environment is. I mean, what it is to people. I think that has to be, if you have a preamble, that has to be in there. I mean, there has to be mention of the basic qualities that we're looking for in the environment. I mean, that's without that, it seems to be I don't understand how you can call it an environmental bill of rights without understanding what the environment is that we're giving the rights to. I mean, that's it's fine to have the right to speak up on something, but if you don't define what the environment is, how can we ensure that happens? And is there, within the bill, is there no onus on government to provide information about the environment and the aspects of the environment that would fall under a Bill of Rights? So I think that's where you need to add to that bill to provide some assurances to people that it's going to work for the issues that are there in the environment, and without it, I mean, that puts most of the onus on individuals to come up with the numbers and the understanding of how the environment affects them. And I don't think that's not a good solution. I think obviously it rests with public government to have a very large responsibility there, and I would assume that must be some of what you're trying to create here.
go back to. Thank you. We'll go back to Mr. O'Reilly first, and then I believe Mr. Testart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Mr. Bevington. Yeah, I think some of the points that you've made here talk about putting more onus on government to take ownership responsibility for environmental rights. This is not an environmental Bill of Rights. This is an Environmental Rights Act. And the only rights established are the ones that are spelled out in the legislation itself. So the right to a healthy environment is not protected as a right. It's only the rights that are set out and defined in the act itself. You asked though about where the putting more onus on government perhaps to maybe don't want to put words in your mouth, but take responsibility or show some leadership on the environment. There is to be state of the environment reporting every 4 years. I'm not sure how that's going to be coordinated with the state of the environment reporting that's done under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, Part 6, which is about the environmental audit that you mentioned that there was a meeting here in Fort Smith last week. I'm not sure how that's going to be coordinated, and I think we will probably need to do some work on that. There's also to be a statement of environmental values developed by each department and agency of GNWT, but it's not clear how that's going to be reviewed, whether there's going to be opportunities for the public to review it, and what it really means in terms of everyday operations, and whether there's any sort of independent oversight of it. That's not clearly set out in the bill either. So I think you've identified an interesting point, and I don't think the bill really addresses that point. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bevington. I just wanted to read out the definition of the environment in the bill, just for clarification, because it was raised. So environment, in this act, environment means all the following existing within the Northwest Territories: A, air, land, surface water, groundwater, snow and ice; B, layers of the atmosphere; C, organic and inorganic matter and living organisms; and D, the interacting natural systems that include components referred to in paragraphs A to C, so the three I read before, environment. So that it's fairly broad and it captures a lot. But I think it's interesting to look at where this legislation started as a private members bill that kind of narrowly set out new means for citizens to access rights to bring their concerns around the environment forward. And now we're seeing an updated piece of legislation that will repeal the old bill and bring some new obligations on government. But what it is not is, as you say, an environmental bill of rights. And I'm really interested in that idea. That's an ongoing conversation we're having, not only as Northerners, but as Canadians and as global citizens, about whether or not these kind of larger issues, the rights to clean air, the rights to a clean environment, ought to be entrenched human rights on a constitutional basis. And is this an opportunity for the Northwest Territories to show leadership on that and to expand the rights of our citizens to access something that is fundamental to the health of our communities, and not only that, but to the identity of Northerners. We take great pride in our natural environment, and the ability to enjoy that environment is a huge part of our culture. So that's something that I'm going to think about as I look to this legislation. I think there's a lot of reporting requirements and aspirational pieces that the new onus is on government to do that work. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to have impact, and it's got to be accessible and inform government decision making. So it's not just reports that get tabled in the legislature or sit on a shelf somewhere. They actually have to matter in terms of how they change planning assumptions, operational assumptions, budgets, policies, legislation, everything. Because the environment can't be just a policy area. It has to be in the underlining foundation of the work that we do as a public government. And finally, I think if we're going to, we have to work within the legislation. So, changing this to a Bill of Rights, I think, is far too broad because this is so narrowly defined. But for the rights that it does provide, making sure that they're as accessible and open to citizens I think is a crucial concern. And there's other legislation that this committee's looked at before, including air quality regulations. You mentioned the right to clean air is extensively in your submission, right? And that's something that other legislation takes a look at, and this legislation could then allow a citizen to go after if they see that monitoring. So we have to. That's a good reminder of how does this piece fit into the other pieces of environmental legislation that might create the transparency and the active monitoring that are required to actually make good use of this. So we've got to find a good way to fit this into all the other pieces. Thank you.
Thank you. Any response to that, Mr. Bevington, or good at this point? Okay, thank you. If there are any other further comments with regard to the Environmental Rights Act? If there are no other comments with regard to the Environmental Rights Act, if we have nothing further on Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act, we'll open the floor to anyone wishing to make comments on Bill 44, the Forest Act. If we have any member of the public that likes to make a comment with regard to Bill 44, the Forest Act, I'll turn the mic over to Mr. Bevington.
Well, I'd be curious, when you talked about the act early on, you mentioned harvesting timber, but you didn't really define harvesting energy. And I was wondering, because that's obviously going to be the biggest use that we make of our forests in the foreseeable future. And it's I think it's incredibly important that that the act deal with the reality of the forests. And so I'd say that I don't know if you're harvesting timber means harvesting but an example, the Finnish biomass system. Not only do they harvest cordwood, they harvest branches, they harvest everything, and they have prices, and they have a system set up which ensures that the whole forest is used when it comes to energy, and it's very efficient. It's their system has increased the use of biomass in their country by twofold over the last decade, and it's something that you have to take really seriously up here, because there are countervailing issues with harvesting in a forest, and you need to look at what is going to take place to understand how the legislation should be written to make sure that the public's interest in using the forests and the interest of conservation and meet up and are correct, and that the rules and regulations that come out of the act encourage the things that we want to see encouraged. So once again, I haven't read the legislation, so I'm really just talking about what I see as issues rather than what you've got in the bill now. But I didn't hear those words when you started out. The other thing that I really think needs to be done with our forests is our forests are, to a large extent, climax forests. They're going to burn. They're going to burn at a greater rate as climate change moves on, and we all know the numbers. Yet, what I've seen, the practice that I've seen, says that when the forest burns, we don't start with a land use plan. Take a burnt forest and decide what's going to happen with it. We don't consider the resource that is standing there and what the best use of it is, how we want to see this forest flourish in the future, how we want to see you know, as things warm up here, different species may be intrusive. So there's you burn land off, and you know, you need to see government, which is most of this public land, needs to have a responsibility to deal with the forests that we've lost, rather than just the forests that we have in place. When you're going to harvest burnt wood, and you know, I've done that off and on for 45 years. You know, it's important to have roads, but if you don't have a plan, a land use plan for an area immediately after a burn, if the government doesn't have the responsibility to get in there and determine what's going to happen to areas once they've burned, then you don't have a very good solutions for anything. In fact, many times you lose most of the resource to rot and fall down and all the rest of that, and you don't have a plan for revitalizing the area, or deciding once an area is burnt whether some of that should become for a different use. So without, and this has gone on, I think, for quite a while, that we haven't taken hold of the you know, vast areas of our land that have been burnt, and we consider, well, let's just leave it to the natural regeneration, which perhaps some of it should be, or maybe 80% of it should be, but there's going to be some of it that is going to be used for different purposes. Maybe some of it's going to be cleared, and we're going to open it up for cultivation. There's other things that can happen in this whole cycle, and I think if you're going to look at forest legislation, you have to deal with the reality that the percentage of forest that we lose every year, and what we're doing with that afterwards is important. How we deal with it, how much is going to be left in a natural state, how we're going to encourage harvesting, what we're going to do with the tourist potential, what we're going to do with a whole number of things that come with land use planning. And I just haven't seen the example of a land use plan for a burnt out area yet, which would give that kind of opportunity to utilize the land, to put it in perspective, or to keep it natural. All those things are important, but they should be decided by people as when these events occur, and they're going to occur with great regularity in the north over the next decades, and we should be prepared to deal with them. So when this is a great opportunity to deal with our forests in a good fashion, and that's something that I think needs to be addressed in legislation, understanding the role of government in dealing with the changing conditions in our forests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bevington. I think you're providing excellent commentary tonight, especially as it relates to a number of aspects that you've raised in with regard to a couple of the previous bills. That, you know, this co-management piece is such an important piece. That's we have in this area in particular, of course, is still unsettled land rights, and so it's very important to contribute or have the contributions of Indigenous governments and Indigenous peoples in their contribution to these bills are so critical in the early days, because ultimately at some point in time these will be pieces of legislation that ultimately will go through another step of devolution and being handed down so that the Indigenous governments take full authority at some point in time. You're right, there's a never-ending multiple uses of forests, especially even burnt-out forests. And right now there doesn't seem to be much planning as it relates to land use plans, and especially again in the unsettled areas. And so, but I think this is what this is all about, and that we're trying to reach those stages where we're going to be able to determine some of those factors and ultimately what regulations and policies will be around land use that'll guide future land use plans. So, if there are other members that care to reply or add additional comment with regard to Mr. Bevington's comments, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so I think I heard a couple of points from Mr. Bevington. I want to thank him for that. One was to ensure that biomass was considered within the scope of the bill, and I can assure you that my reading of the definition of forest and forest resources would include biomass. I'm just going to turn to the bill itself here for a second. Forest means trees, grass, vegetation, or other forest resources situated on undeveloped land. So it includes trees, obviously. Forest ecosystem, trees, shrubs, vegetation, other forest resources, wildlife, natural occurrences, soil and wetlands, wildlife, and other living organisms. Forest resources means products of vegetative origin in or derived from forests, whether alive or dead, including fungi. So I'm not a lawyer, but my plain language reading this would have me to believe that biomass is clearly within the scope of the bill. You did raise, though, some other facts about concerns around the planning of forests now and into the future after fires and so on. And there is provision in the bill for forest ecosystem management plans, but they're discretionary. They're not mandatory. They're discretionary, and but those plans have to be in place before forestry agreements can be issued by the minister or signed by the minister, which is a good thing. But it doesn't say that the agreements have to be consistent with or conform to the management plans, which is a concern of mine. But I think also there is provision in here for state of forest monitoring of the state of the forest ecosystem by the supervisor, but it's not mandatory, and there's no public reporting required of that monitoring or even wrapping it up in a state of the forest report. But it can capture things including forest health, forest carbon, forest change, sustainable use. I think those are all good things to list out in here, but there's no mandatory public reporting, which I think is an issue. There is no coordination with co-management bodies that carry out land use planning. There's nothing in here other than to say that, of course, the land rights agreements take precedence over this and that it recognizes that there's a co-management system, but it doesn't spell out how this is to be coordinated with a co-management system in any way, which I think is a problem. I guess the last couple of things I would point out in comment to your points here is that there are no clear opportunities for public participation in developing a forest ecosystem management plan, in looking at a forestry agreement, and then there's forest licenses and permits that can also be issued. No clear public documentation of that, no public registry, no right for the public to be engaged or involved in that, or even for Indigenous governments to be engaged or involved in any of that process either. That's a real problem, and we've heard, I think, some of that, but I think some of your comments, again, highlight the need for the public and Indigenous governments to be built right into what is we see in this legislation. So thank you again.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bevington. Again, very, very good submissions. I do not support the bill in its current form. I didn't at second reading, and I still am skeptical of it. And the fundamental issue for me is the lack of incorporating the co-management systems into the bill, and the strong opposition from many Indigenous nations who are involved in the co-drafting process. Earlier today, you mentioned the importance of, with the lack of clearly defined constitutional future for the Northwest Territories, devolution is a key test of our relationships and the future we're building for our territory and our people. And I think the co-drafting has been largely successful in proving that Indigenous people have a seat at the table. Indigenous people and nations who have signed on to the agreement have a seat at the table and largely feel engaged in that process. In this case, the bill the committee has before today is a bill that was not at the co-drafting process. It's a new bill. They haven't seen it, and the proper thing to do is to send it back to the table and allow them the opportunity to see the bill in its current form before it gets to this stage. And given the very important issues that my colleague raised and that are in the body of the bill and that have been raised by Indigenous governments, I'm not prepared to support it today either, and I don't think my position will change as we move through it, because there are just far too many technical technical problems and political problems with this piece of legislation. It's bad legislation. It needs to be defeated and go back to the co-management process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Any further comments on Bill 44, the Forest Act? If there are no further comments from the public with regard to Bill 44, the Forest Act, there are no further comments in general or presentations from the public. Do members agree that this agenda item is concluded? Agreed. Thank you, members. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank everybody who joined us today. As MLAs, it is a privilege to be here and to hear directly from you. When we make our report in the upcoming sitting of the Legislative Assembly, we will highlight the feedback we received during these meetings and other public submissions. So, if you still do happen to have any other questions about the bills or want to make a written submission, then you're free to talk to our committee clerk, and you can also always visit the Legislative Assembly's website. So without further ado, I will adjourn this public meeting. Thank you.